This is Siracusa, a lovely old city in Sicily which is a real treat. Hello and welcome, or welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love history and travel. Today we're visiting a city that's been on the map since it was first established around 734 BCE by Greek settlers from Corinth. It has much to see, including sites from that time, sites that are only 2,000 years old, sites that were rebuilt during the Baroque era after an enormous earthquake, and some modern buildings. Some of them are more interesting than others. Tourist Siracusa is divided into two distinct sections. The first inhabited area is an island in the harbor called Ortigya. The other area is on the mainland and is now the home of an archaeological park and more. It was built by the Greek and later Roman inhabitants and is called Neapolis, which means new city. New here is relative. The underpinnings here date back at least 2 millennia. Now let's take a look at Siracusa today on The Armchair Traveler. Ortigya is an island and the ancient heart of Siracusa. Its name actually means quail. This was too odd for me not to look it up. Most cities have a foundational myth, but it turns out that Ortigya has two. The first explains why the island exists separate from the mainland. It tells us that a goddess, or possibly a nymph, named Asteria was pursued by the Greek god Zeus. Asteria turned herself into a quail so she could fly away and escape from him, but he continued to chase her, so she finally threw herself into the sea. She wasn't reborn as a goddess, but metamorphosed into the island of Ortigya. The second myth explains a freshwater spring, probably where it has no business being. The story goes that yet another chaste nymph, this time called Arethusa, found herself fleeing the unwelcome attention of a lesser member of the gods, a river called Alpheus. Arethusa turned into a spring to escape him. The spring, which is also a pool, sits just inshore a few dozen feet from the salt waters of the Ionian Sea. The Greeks needed an explanation for how the fresh water could have been there in the first place, and I think that was it. We'll visit the spring later on in our tour. This map shows you the so-called new city, or Neapolis. It sits uphill and a bit inland from the harbor area. The new city dates back to the 5th century BCE. Much of the original area, although unfortunately not all of it, is now an archaeological park. It has remains of both Greek and Roman era buildings. The entire area was built on top of a limestone cliff. That was very handy for mining stone for the early construction. Italy is famous for Mount Etna, which erupts, sometimes spectacularly, and also causes smaller but usually local earthquakes. Etna cannot be blamed for the big one of 1693, which had its probable epicenter just off the Sicilian coast near Augusta, as is shown in this map. Siracusa was rebuilt afterwards in the Sicilian Baroque style. These are the remains of the Temple of Apollo. In its day, this was probably the most important temple in what the Romans referred to as Greater Greece or Magna Graecia. In antiquity, Greece was far larger than the area we see today and stretched to include what we think of not only of today's Greece, but southern Italy and Sicily. The temple was large, sturdy, and the remains are attractive to us, perhaps because so much of it is familiar to modern eyes. The temple survived antiquity because it was repeatedly repurposed. It was closed during the persecution of the pagans in the late period of the Roman Empire. It then reopened as a Byzantine church. It was closed after that and reopened as a mosque during the period of Islamic control of the island. Eventually, the Normans defeated the Saracens and ousted them. They then reconstituted this as a Christian church. Later on, in the 1600s, when the Spanish controlled the island, it became a military barracks. With each repurposing, there were modifications and renovations, although the basic structure and the sturdy columns and floors, as well as some of the walls, remained intact. In the inset is the facade of St. Paul's Church. This is a Baroque-era building, but it stands on the site of a much older church. It was named to honor St. Paul, who had been shipwrecked in Malta, but also spent some time here. Syracusa's cathedral was built on the foundations of a 5th century BCE temple dedicated to the goddess Athena. Athena was the goddess of war and was worshipped in the area as their patron. The Tyrannos, or king of Syracuse at the time, was a man named Gelon. He had the temple built, perhaps as an offering, after his victory over the Carthaginians in the Battle of Himera in 480 BCE. In this war, Syracuse and Agrigento, which we'll tour in a future visit, were in an alliance against the Carthaginians, who controlled the western half of the island. Syracuse won, and some say crippled the Carthaginians for decades. From the visible remains of the temple, embedded in today's cathedral, we can tell it must have been magnificent and absolutely appropriate and adequate for the purpose. The temple was preceded by a cult site on the same area which dated back to the 8th century BCE. No matter what religion, this has been holy ground for 7,000 years. Today's cathedral was built in the 7th century, repurposing the columns into the walls of the new building. It was massively rebuilt after the 1693 earthquake. The woman in the facade is the Virgin Mary, to whom the church is dedicated. A good builder never complains about his or her tools or lets good building material go to waste. These views clearly show the antique-era temple columns repurposed into today's cathedral walls. People come to this area to gawk at the gorgeous blue sky that seems to melt seamlessly into the equally gorgeous blue water of the harbor, as you can see in the photo on the left. The day I visited, except for a few children who were looking at the ducks, no one was looking at the pond. The Fonte de Arethusa confused the bejabbers out of me because I assumed fonte meant fountain, and when I got there I was confronted by this algae-stained pool. It turns out that fonte means spring, not fountain. This is a legendary cradle of the city where a nymph named Arethusa took refuge as a satyr was chasing her. She ended up being changed into a spring to escape him. On the left of the view of the harbor and in the background is Maniace Castle, a 13th century fort built by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. The building remained an active military site until World War II. You can see people standing on the seawall in the foreground just above some plants. The area with the plants is the pool, fed by the spring. That spring, which would have provided fresh water to anyone living nearby, must have seemed like a miracle to the original settlers. Perhaps the real story of the pool and the reason it's been remembered for so long isn't about a nymph or a maiden in distress. It was about potable water. On the right you can see some of the ducks who hang out in the pool, as well as the papyrus that grows in it. This nice flat area was far too tempting not to have something built on it from the time the first Greek settlers arrived from Corinth. It had a sanctuary dedicated to Persephone and Demeter, built by Gelon, who we met earlier, but eventually the temple was moved to the mainland. I thought the fountain was quite lovely. I initially assumed it was carved out of something like limestone, which you see all over the city, but when I looked it up, I found out it was built in the early 1900s and was made of cast concrete. Ortigya is full of narrow streets, mostly pedestrianized, and an absolute mecca not just for shoppers but for shutterbugs like me. When I visited in early April, neither the usual horde of tourists nor the pickpockets who prey on them were in evidence. I took this photo from the Temple of Apollo that we visited earlier. Ortigya is an island and it's connected to the mainland by just 2 bridges. One of the bridges features a modern statue of Archimedes. Like so much modern artwork, this was quite controversial when it was installed. The statue shows the mathematician and inventor standing proud and tall and holding a mirror, from which he imagined he could develop a kind of death ray to incinerate the ships of Syracusa's Roman enemies. I read that most people don't like it. You can see the mirror circled in the detail photo on the right. If you're curious about Archimedes, I have a Makers of History profile on him and his significance in my WordPress blog site. The link is in the description box below. Every respectable Greek or Roman city or town in antiquity had a forum. This was a place for the elite to meet and greet, to transact various businesses, to administer law, and a great deal of shopping, dining, and drinking also took place here. Many former Roman forums continue to serve their original purpose as public meeting spaces. They are generally located in the center of town on a nice flat space. Sometimes not just bits and pieces of walls, columns, and floors, but even an occasional Roman basilica, long ago converted into a church, can be found. In the case of Syracuse, little from antiquity remains, just some columns and a stretch of Roman road. The red arrow points to what I believe was the original Roman-era road. Whatever it was, it's ongoing proof that when the Romans built something, they built for keeps. The first stop on my way from the Forum to the archaeological park was a pantheon. It's a parish church today, but it was actually built as a monument to those killed in World War I. The inside is rather nicer than the outside, in my opinion, but there was a service going on. I don't take pictures during services, so this one comes courtesy of Wikimedia Commons. The marker on the exterior translates as, "In memory of the martyrs and heroes of the resistance and of the War of Liberation," so as to be a warning in the books that the oppressed people might rise again in freedom and law. I think if you put shovel to dirt anywhere in the general area of the city, you'd excavate something. A bit of road, part of a column, left over from antiquity. The Church of Our Lady of the Tears is modern, but it is no exception. Although it is much smaller, it is actually built on the site of the replacement temple of Demeter and Persephone that we talked about earlier. It incorporates not only part of the floor, but some of the original altar. This church is supposed to resemble a teardrop from the outside. In 1953, a woman was praying to an ordinary mass-produced plaque depicting the Virgin Mary, and it is said that the plaque responded with real tears. The tears purportedly were the source of many miracles throughout Italy. Pope Pius XII approved of the miraculous weeping of the tears and said that they were found by 4 different doctors to actually be human. This was considered to be a huge miracle. This huge church makes a great landmark when navigating your way around the city. As you can see in my photos, the exterior is very modern and made of cast concrete. The locals thought the church didn't blend very well with the local landscape, but that was just a tumbled-down, weed-filled lot. At first I thought they might have something. I thought it was ugly. I was prepared to absolutely hate it, but the more I looked, the more there was to see and like. It certainly made my daylight navigation much easier. The new city, or Neapolis, is where the archaeological park is now. It sits mostly on top of a large limestone deposit which has been extensively quarried since antiquity. The Latomia del Paradiso is the name of the quarry. This area has provided building materials since it was first established as part of the city of Syracuse. Much of that has been recycled and repurposed over time into newer buildings. So when you see a limestone facade in the main city, the odds are that a Greek workman originally cut it off the cliff more than 2 millennia ago. History tells us that this is where 7,000 survivors of the war between Syracuse and Athens in 413 BC were imprisoned. Originally, at least part of this area was apparently roofed over, but all that collapsed, as did so much else either during or shortly after the 1693 earthquake, leaving it exposed to sunlight and making it an ideal place for these lovely gardens. Perhaps the biggest of the big-ticket items here in the archaeological park is the Greek Theater, now partially restored and used in the summertime as an outdoor entertainment venue. The Greeks designed and built this into a limestone hill in the 5th century BCE, set so that it overlooked the city and eventually the sea, although the modern trees you can see in the background block the view. Its grand opening featured a performance of the play Perseus by a Greek writer named Aeschylus. It was modified and enlarged at least once by the Greeks and then changed again by the Romans to give it an elongated horseshoe shape rather than the semicircle that the Greeks had always favored. Not all the seating has been restored and people are bigger today than they were then, but in its prime, the best guess is it could have seated 16,000 people. Scholars believe that the building remained in use until the 5th century AD, after which it was abandoned. By that time, it was some 900 years old. The theater didn't fall into ruin all by itself. Charles V of Spain ordered it mined for its pre-cut limestone, some of which went into fortifying Ortigya. The way the facility is sited, there's no shade, and as far as I know, the Greeks didn't put up awnings like the Romans did, for example, in the Colosseum. Somewhere along the line, however, the Romans did put in a branch from an aqueduct at the top of the building. This has been restored, and there's a pool of water with a kind of natural rock fountain to tempt visitors to this day. In my main photo, you can see that workmen had been installing a floor on the stage and the backdrop, although it was too early for me to visit a performance. The triangular-shaped building in the background, top right, is the Dome of Our Lady of the Tears, which we just saw. The brick building on the lower right is a medieval watch. I arrived at the theater on a gloriously sunny day in April and soon overheated. The way the facility is sited, there's no shade, and as far as I know, the Greeks didn't put up awnings as the Romans did, for example, on the Colosseum in Rome. Somewhere along the line, however, the Romans did put in a branch from an aqueduct at the top of the facility. This has been restored, and a pool of water with a kind of natural rock fountain is there to tempt visitors to this day. We met the artist Caravaggio during my City Sites tour of Valletta, Malta. The man was an enormously influential artist, but he was also a huge rogue and a criminal. He was wanted in Italy, among other people, by his creditors and outraged husbands whose wives he had seduced. He fled and landed for a spell in Malta, but the Maltese authorities eventually became disenchanted and chased him out. He landed here in Sicily, specifically in Siracusa, where he set up shop with his enormous skill, easel, brushes, and paint, and in between bouts of work did some sightseeing. Caravaggio is said to have named this area the Ear of Dionysius. It isn't a completely natural formation. It was apparently dug into a limestone cave during antiquity as water storage for the city of Syracuse. A narrow tunnel was dug into the top at first. The tunnel was widened by digging down and sideways afterwards, giving the cave its unusual shape. The small narrow tunnel is still visible at the top of the cave. The earthquake struck this area as well, causing considerable damage and made the cave unusable for water storage afterwards. Today it is notable for its excellent acoustics. The legend says that originally a Greek tyrant or king named Dionysius used the cave as a prison for political dissidents so that he could eavesdrop on captives. Another, far more gruesome legend claims that Dionysius carved the cave into its shape so that it would amplify the screams of the prisoners being tortured in it for his personal gratification. I'm not too sure about these stories, but I can tell you that the area was cool and shady, and I appreciated being out of the sun. Incidentally, the Italian word for ear is orecchio. You'll find ear-shaped pasta by this name in every store in Sicily to this day. Siracusa was a harbor and a seafaring nation, so rope for the ships was an extremely important and valuable commodity. This area is called the Cord Maker's Grotto. You can see the mouth of it, but you can't get too close. In antiquity, humidity would have been an essential ingredient in making rope, and the cave apparently provided it. We met the Syracusan king or tyrant named Heron a bit earlier in our walk. He was an enormously outsized personality who created enormously outsized monuments and facilities. This one is called Heron's Altar, or the Great Altar of Syracuse, and is the largest altar known from antiquity. The story goes that the king wanted an extra-large facility to allow for massive sacrifices to the gods. Most likely, he also did this to show his own power and authority. The altar sat originally in or near a temple, which must have been even larger, but of which almost no trace remains today. Archaeologists think that, like the temple, most of the altar had been quarried away and used to build the walls of Ortigya. The Roman theater is one of the best preserved structures in the city from the Roman imperial period, although nothing to compare, in my opinion, with the Greek theater which we visited earlier. The base and some of the sections of it were dug into the rock, and much of that part actually remains intact. The upper portions were made of masonry, much of which was either appropriated or damaged after the fall of Rome. I already knew that anything the Romans did was usually grander, but the Greeks did it first. The magnitude of the accomplishment becomes much clearer when you remind yourself that all of this was done by hand and animal labor using ropes and buckets, cranes and shovels. I made several day trips from Siracusa, so I wasn't able to do much in the way of dining out. My apartment was more than adequate, but the promised included breakfast had to be taken across the street in a bar. Fortunately for me, there was an excellent supermarket nearby, one of the best I saw in all of Sicily. It might not have looked like much from the outside, but the inside was a two-story wonder. I provisioned. I got a roast chicken, some bread and cheese, olives, yogurt, stuffed pasta with spinach and cheese, and something billed as the local white wine at €3 a bottle. It wasn't very good. Next time I'll spend more. Thank you for joining me today to see Siracusa, complete with antiquities, sirens, Baroque architecture, and more. Come back next time for another city walk on The Armchair Traveler.